The winter of 1917 clung to the Western Front like a heavy shadow. Snow melted into trenches, rifles rusted under the damp air, and millions of soldiers wondered if the new year would finally break the deadlock choking Europe. For more than 2 years, the front lines had barely moved. France was exhausted, Britain was battered, and Germany, though still holding most of its early gains, was bleeding manpower faster than it could replace. But beneath that frozen landscape, something was changing. Generals from all sides sat hunched over maps, tracing lines that had hardly shifted since 1914. Yet each of them dreamed of one decisive blow, one offensive that might finally end the nightmare. What none of them knew was that 1917 would become a year of gambles, a year when even victory could feel like defeat. And it begins with one man, General Robert Nivelle, a French commander convinced he had discovered the formula to break the stalemate. Nivelle's rise was meteoric. After Verdun, where his relentless counterattacks pushed the Germans back step by step, he became a symbol of hope to a nation worn thin by loss. He offered something rare, confidence. His message was simple but electrifying. He said, "I know how to win." Newspapers loved him, politicians trusted him, and soldiers, desperate for a breakthrough, believed him. But on the other side of the front, Germany was learning too. After the slaughter of Verdun and the Somme, German leaders realized something frightening. If the war continued like this, they would collapse before their enemies did. So Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff made a radical decision. They would no longer fight the war the old way. Instead of defending every trench to the last man, they would create something new, an elastic defense. A defense designed not to resist each attack head-on, but to absorb it, bend, and then snap back with brutal efficiency. 3 layers of defense, hidden machine gun nests, reverse slopes, deep tunnels, and the plan to trick their enemies into wasting lives against empty positions. It was a system built from bitter lessons, and it was about to be tested. Meanwhile, in Britain, Field Marshal Douglas Haig faced his own problems. His troops had fought hard in 1916, and the losses were staggering. But new tactics were emerging. Platoons were learning to move in scattered formations, not tight lines. Officers were being trained to make decisions quickly, without waiting for orders that might never come. Artillery was becoming more precise, more synchronized. Rolling barrages now crept across no man's land like a moving wall of steel. The Canadians trained relentlessly for one objective, Vimy Ridge, a towering position that had resisted every assault since 1914. If Britain's diversionary attack worked, it would force the Germans to pull reserves away from the sector where Nivelle planned his knockout blow. And Nivelle believed absolutely in that blow. His plan was bold, too bold, some argued. A massive assault along the Aisne, punching through the German lines in 24 to 48 hours. After that breakthrough, French cavalry and reserves would pour through the gap, sweeping into the German rear and collapsing their entire position in the west. To Nivelle, the logic was perfect. To his critics, it was a fantasy. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George hated the plan. Italian and Russian fronts were weakening. German positions were improving. And worst of all, Nivelle was talking too much. Soldiers joked they knew the date of the offensive before they even received their own orders. German intelligence certainly did. Still, Nivelle refused to change course. He believed results, not doubts, would decide everything. But fate had other plans. In the final days of winter, Germany did something unprecedented. They withdrew. They pulled back from their long-held salient to the newly created Hindenburg Line, a carefully engineered fortress system miles behind their old positions. Villages were emptied, roads destroyed, bridges blown apart, everything of value carried away or burned. To the Allies, it felt like a trap, and in many ways it was. The German withdrawal shortened their front by dozens of kilometers, freeing 13 entire divisions for future battles, and it eliminated exactly the terrain Nivelle had spent months planning to attack. Yet Nivelle insisted the offensive must continue. British troops entered the abandoned German trenches cautiously. They found deep dugouts, tunnels, and even booby traps, silent reminders that the enemy had left on its own terms. One British soldier described seeing piles of empty beer bottles, wires rigged to explosives, and trenches so well built they seemed almost like underground houses. The Western Front was changing, but the armies of 1917 were marching toward one more colossal clash. Britain moved first. On April 9th, under sleet and freezing wind, the British launched the Battle of Arras. The opening bombardment shook the ground for miles. Aircraft circled overhead, spotting artillery targets with precision never seen before. And when the whistle blew, the Canadian Corps surged forward toward Vimy Ridge, their movements precise, rehearsed, and deadly effective. The Germans were stunned. By the end of the day, Vimy Ridge, once considered nearly impregnable, was in Allied hands. It was one of the greatest tactical victories Britain had achieved in the entire war. But not everywhere went smoothly. South, at Bullecourt, the Australians and New Zealanders faced chaos. Tanks meant to crush the wire bogged down or were destroyed. Orders were confused. Communication failed. Brave soldiers fought their way forward anyway, but German strongpoints held firm, machine guns ripping through the smoke. The result was heartbreakingly predictable. Heavy losses, little gain. But all of this, the victories, the failures, the sacrifices, was only the opening act, because the real storm was gathering on the Chemin des Dames. There, Nivelle would launch his grand offensive. There, France would gamble its future, and there, in April 1917, the hope of a quick victory would collide with the brutal reality of modern warfare. The spring of 1917 arrived not with hope, but with a grinding sense of inevitability. Every soldier on the Western Front knew something huge was coming. Artillery shells piled up in long rows, fresh divisions marched toward the lines, and the rumble of supply trains echoed through the French countryside day and night. General Robert Nivelle's great offensive, the attack he claimed would end the war in 48 hours, was no longer just a plan. It was a countdown. Inside French headquarters, Nivelle radiated confidence. He spoke rapidly, gesturing across maps, telling officers how the German line would crack under the weight of an unprecedented artillery storm. He dismissed every warning. He dismissed every criticism. And he insisted that Germany, worn down by 2.5 years of war, would not be able to adapt to his method. What he did not realize, what would soon doom his offensive, was that the Germans had already adapted. Along the Chemin des Dames ridge, German engineers worked around the clock. Tunnels were carved through chalk stone. Bunkers were reinforced with steel. Machine guns were positioned on reverse slopes, hidden from French artillery. Observation posts were dug deep, linked by underground corridors that allowed entire companies to survive days of bombardment. German defensive positions were no longer just trenches. They were layered systems, braced to bend and then strike back. But Nivelle pressed forward. For 14 days, French guns unleashed one of the most intense bombardments in the entire war. Villages turned to dust, hillsides collapsed, entire forests were shredded into splinters. The ground shook so violently that in Paris, miles away, windows rattled from the distant thunder. French artillerymen watched the devastation with grim satisfaction. Many believed nothing could survive such fire. Even some German prisoners taken during the shelling confessed they did not expect to live through it. But beneath the ground, shielded in deep tunnels and reinforced rooms, thousands of German soldiers waited. They listened to the rumble above them, counting the shells and tightening their grips on their rifles. They knew the French were coming. They knew the attack was imminent, and they were preparing for the moment the artillery lifted. When dawn broke on April 16, 1917, the French infantry climbed out of their trenches and began moving across the open ground. Rain hammered down. The mud clung to their boots, slowing every step. Many had been told they would walk through a shattered, defeated enemy. Instead, they marched into a storm of fire. The first sign that something was wrong came within minutes. Machine guns, silent during the bombardment, suddenly erupted from hidden emplacements. Barbed wire that was supposed to be cut by artillery stood intact, glistening with rain. Shelters the French believed destroyed were still occupied, and German soldiers emerged firing with deadly calm. On the slopes of the ridge, Senegalese colonial infantry advanced with determination, but they faced an impossible situation. German guns positioned behind the crest of the hill opened fire, hitting them before they even saw the enemy. In a matter of minutes, entire companies were pinned down, unable to move forward or retreat. Officers were lost early, leaving units confused and exposed. The next waves of French troops moved forward, but instead of reinforcing success, they collided with men falling back, turning narrow trenches into chaos. Orders were shouted, then drowned in the roar of artillery. Runners struggled to reach their commanders. Radio lines snapped. Maps proved useless in the churned mud. And still, Nivelle insisted the breakthrough was coming. He urged his generals to push harder, assuring them everything was under control. But the reality was stark. The attack had stalled on almost the entire front by midday. The advance was shallow, expensive, and vulnerable from both flanks. By the afternoon, rain turned the battlefield into a swamp. Tanks, slow, early machines bogged down or were picked off by German gunners. French troops clung to small patches of captured ground under constant fire from positions they believed no longer existed. In some sectors, German counterattack units surged forward, striking exhausted French soldiers who had been fighting since dawn. The French artillery, low on ammunition after firing millions of shells, struggled to support the infantry. Communications had broken down. Entire battalions were isolated. Yet many French soldiers fought with remarkable courage. They held their positions despite the odds, refusing to abandon the wounded or give up ground that had cost so much. But courage could not compensate for a failed strategy. By the end of the first day, the promise of a 48-hour victory had become an illusion. The French army dug in on shattered ground, rain-soaked and weary. Casualties climbed rapidly, and Nivelle, still insisting success was close, ordered the assault to continue the next day. But every new attack produced the same outcome: small gains, enormous losses. German defenders, using their elastic system, withdrew just enough to survive the French assault, then counterattacked with fresh units. They fought from cellars, from caves, from fortified tunnels deep within the ridge. The French, advancing uphill through mud, simply could not overwhelm such positions. On April 17th, the French army made one last major push. They captured more prisoners, seized some positions, and even forced German units back in certain areas. But the cost was devastating. Units that began the attack with 800 men were reduced to fewer than 200 within 48 hours. The hoped-for breakthrough never came. By April 20th, German commanders were confident the offensive had failed. One staff officer wrote that it was clear that the battle had already been won by the defenders. The French continued attacking into early May, but the momentum was gone. Exhaustion, fear, and despair spread through the ranks. Then the cracks appeared. Whole regiments refused to go back into the line. Soldiers wrote letters demanding explanations, and across the French army, whispers of revolt began to grow. The Nivelle offensive had not only failed, it had broken the morale of one of the largest armies in the world. In Paris, the government realized the danger. Nivelle was dismissed. General Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, took command with a single mission: save the army from collapse. But the cost of Nivelle's gamble remained. The offensive had taken over 130,000 French casualties, shaken national confidence, and left the Allies without the breakthrough they desperately needed. And as France reeled, the burden of continuing the war shifted heavily onto British shoulders. The Western Front had not yet been won or lost, but 1917 had revealed a terrifying truth. Even the most confident plans could shatter against the cold reality of modern war. The failure of the Nivelle offensive sent shockwaves across Europe. It wasn't just another battlefield setback. It was a national trauma. France, already bled white by Verdun and the Somme, now faced its darkest moment of the war. For the first time since 1914, the French army, once the pride of the Republic, once the shield that held back the German advance, began to fracture. Soldiers who had fought through endless bombardments, mud, gas, hunger, and unimaginable loss finally reached a breaking point. Whispers spread from trench to trench. Whispers turned into arguments. Arguments turned into defiance. Entire regiments refused orders to return to the front. They were not cowards. They were not traitors. They were men who had survived the worst horrors of the war and could no longer accept dying for plans that seemed doomed from the start. The French High Command panicked. The government trembled. Paris feared that one more failed offensive could spark a collapse that would end the war in Germany's favor. Into this chaos stepped General Philippe Pétain. He was no dreamer, no gambler. He was a realist, a soldier who understood that before the army could fight again, it had to be healed. He stopped suicidal attacks. He improved food rations. He increased leave, allowing exhausted soldiers to see their families. He listened to grievances instead of silencing them. Slowly, painfully, trust was rebuilt. The French army did not collapse, but it no longer had the strength to launch massive offensives on its own. Allied strategy changed in a single moment. From the plains of Picardy to the ridges of Flanders, the burden shifted to the only force still growing in strength, the British Expeditionary Force. Under Field Marshal Haig, the British began to prepare for a new series of assaults, attacks that would culminate in the infamous Passchendaele campaign, where mud swallowed men, horses, and machines. Yet even as Britain braced for the next chapter, another storm was forming far away that would reshape the entire war. In Russia, revolution tore apart the Eastern Front. In Germany, starvation and unrest grew under the strain of blockade, and across the Atlantic, a new power stirred: the United States. American entry into the war in April 1917 promised fresh troops, fresh industry, fresh hope. But those forces would take time to train, time to arrive, time to make a difference. Until then, the Allies faced a simple, brutal reality. They had to survive 1917, and the German army, strengthened by new defensive tactics and freed from the Nivelle disaster, had no intention of making that easy. The spring offensives of 1917 were meant to break the deadlock. They were meant to end the war. Instead, they revealed the harsh truth of industrial conflict. In World War I, even victory could taste like defeat. Yet despite the failures, despite the unbearable losses, the armies on the Western Front held the line. France endured its mutinies. Britain prepared for the battles to come. Germany braced for renewed assaults. And with the arrival of American troops still months away, the war staggered into its fourth year, a year that would bring new offensives, new weapons, new leaders, and ultimately redefine the fate of nations. The spring of 1917 did not end the First World War, but it marked the moment when every side realized what the war had truly become: a struggle that would not be won by brilliance or bold promises, but by endurance, adaptation, and the will to continue when everything seemed lost. This is how the Western Front survived 1917, and how the war marched relentlessly toward its final explosive act.